This program is brought to you as a public service by Maui Causes. Maui Causes is a crowd-funded media production group that provides media production services to a variety of environmental and progressive causes here in Maui County. Visit us on the web at www.mauicauses.org. Welcome to another edition of Maui Causes and the Citizens Initiative television show. I don't know what else to call it. It's a TV show. Here we are on Akaku. And thank you, Akaku, for giving us access to your resources and the pipeline, such as it is, that Time Warner provides for the Maui community. You know, when we shoot this stuff in the studio, it looks a hell of a lot better than it looks like on your television set. And that's because Time Warner doesn't want it to look good. They don't want these messages out to the public. They try and stifle this entire process. The powers that be in the state of Hawaii, one of the most corrupt states in the nation, does not really want these programs on the air. They don't want you knowing what's really going on in your community because they want to continue to exploit you and the natural resources of Maui and Hawaii in general. It's a good old boys club from the plantation families on down, and it's still in power today. And this show, Maui Causes, is dedicated to disrupting that particular situation and giving you the power back. The people, the power belongs to the people. And we hope that you will participate in the process. We hope you'll go to mauicauses.org and take a look, participate as best you can, but participate in the process. This is your community. Support new leaders that are coming, stepping forward, because they finally see that the community is rising up and participating. So, you know, register to vote and vote. Come to community meetings and meet the candidates that are coming out for county council. Meet the candidates that are going for state senate seats. Meet the candidates and understand what's going on in your community, because if you ain't at the table, you are on the menu. Okay, so enough politics. We're going to talk about other subject this afternoon that also people kind of don't like to talk about very much, but it's necessary and it's really a part of life, and that is the end of life. And in our community, we are very lucky to have with us here in the studio and in our community, Bodhi Be. And Bodhi is the director of Doorway into Light, something called the Death Store, which is a really cool place and worth checking out. There should be a death store next to every Starbucks. Next to every Starbucks, there should be a death store. You know, it ties in. You're wondering, why are we talking about this on a social causes show? Because it really does not having an understanding and an intimate relationship with your own mortality allows the powers that be to just convince you that, you know, short-term profits and, you know, your cell phone are the most important things in life. And they're not the most important things in life. There's stuff that's way more important. And having an intimate relationship with your own mortality really, really, really is a fundamental thing that allows people to understand that. So, Bodhi, thank you so much for the work that you've been doing for years now to bring an understanding, bring an education of death into everyday life.
Wow, you said it all.
Well, we can go home then. Well, no, let's get into...
I would say, in response to what you just said, that what we're up to actually is very social and political. Political in the sense that every dollar we spend is a vote. And who are we empowering with that dollar, and what are we empowering with that dollar? And certainly the cemetery industry, the casket making industry, the funeral industry are massive billion-dollar industries, and just like the food industry, when we've given away something, often toxic and unholistic and destructive practices are used for the sake of efficiency and money making. And we we decided at some point to start a funeral home, the only nonprofit funeral home in the state of Hawaii.
That's great.
Almost everybody has a horror story about what happened when they went to the funeral home, and often in shock, emotionally unbalanced, grieving, not the best state of mind to make a business decision. And so much of what's happened to, death and dying has turned into a business decision and transaction.
And it's not just, there's nothing necessarily wrong with business. Business can be a good thing.
I've got to pay the rent.
But there's something called predatory capitalism, which uses all of the regulations and structure that is built around business to their advantage against the best interests of the public. That becomes predatory capitalism, and that's kind of where we draw the line.
Well, even that I wouldn't say is a fine line. There's lots of good mom and pop funeral homes in this country, and they're in business. And if they're in business, they're in sales. And to be in sales is, and most people at funeral homes have had the experience of wanting to be upsold something.
Even at a mom and pop shop.
I mean, come on, it's the last gift you'll give to grandma kind of thing. In fact, you said predatory. I like to say we don't prey upon you, we'll pray for and with you. Very much so. And we're trying to take it out of the realm of business, really because we're motivated about community building. At the core of community building is how we take care of each other.
Yeah.
And we have given something away. We have given a lot away to industries. Even hospice, which is a beautiful thing, is a massive billion-dollar institution. Many hospices coming online now are for-profit businesses.
Right.
There's so much government money. So to take something back and to reclaim it as community village building work, and to expand even its understanding, because death and dying in this country, we're basically illiterate. We are basically illiterate about what death and dying mean. Is there value in dying? What's the point? Most people want to die in their sleep. The end of life, death with dignity, choosing to end one's life, physician-assisted death. These are becoming the biggest probably issues of the rest of our lives, and will be. And it's a very slippery slope to. First of all, soon every state will have will make it, will overcome any Christian bias towards passing legislation for the right to death with dignity, as it's called. So part of what we're doing, Doorway into Light, since 2006, is really educational programs to inform people that, first of all, what the laws are, what their choices are, and to kind of expand and grow the conversation that dying is not just a medical event, it's not just a psychological event, it's not like any other event.
Right. You
might have little deaths in your life, but that's not the same as dying. When I ask a group of people, when do you start to die, most people say when you're born. I thought that at one point myself until I was sitting by the bed of people who were dying, and I realized they were doing something I wasn't doing.
Right.
There are so many stories embedded in our culture about what dying means, what death means, what happens after we die, and those stories are playing out in our subconscious and conscious minds. So Doorway into Light has stepped into putting on educational programs. We're in the middle of one here on Maui, where every Monday night this month we've done, the first Monday of the month was preparation for death. We're going to die and we don't know when. One of the most known things there is to us, we're going to die and we don't know when, is certainly one of the least known about and least talked about. And the most common response is, who wants to talk about that? That's morbid. And the other end of that is, we have plenty of time to think about that. And when people say we have plenty of time, I like to say, well, in America, the statistic is that 400 people die every day from accidents. 400 people go to bed tonight and will die tomorrow, not knowing that tonight is the last night.
Surprise.
And tomorrow night, 400 people will go to bed, and the next day they'll die, not knowing this was their last day. And most of us are so jaded by information that we don't think those 400 people are us or our people or our kids or friends. It happens to other 400 people.
Somebody else.
I talk to other people. They don't think it's them either. So that was the first Monday. The second Monday was full spectrum caring for the dying. What does it mean to sit at the bedside? What is your role? How can you be useful when somebody's dying? You're not really accompanying them. They're on a trip that they're going to do, and you're not going to do with them. But you can be useful. And the third Monday night, which was last night, was how do we care for the dead? What are the laws? What are the choices? What's a home funeral? What should we do? We're one of the only funeral homes in the state that does ocean body burial. Mm-hmm. The people know they can have their loved one at home after they die. We've done beautiful ritual and ceremony that we've helped families themselves create to have a funeral in the home. And then what's a green burial? And we work with a Makawao nonprofit cemetery that allows us to do simple green burials. No embalming, no metal or concrete or plastic grave liners. They'll allow us to bury people in a cardboard box.
Right.
So those kind of things people don't know about. So much of it is education. Being the only nonprofit funeral home is we really want to help people. Yes, we need to pay the rent. Yes, we need to put gas in the hearse, but we're really out to help people. And we work with people regardless of what their financial situation is. And there are a lot of people on this island and this county that can't afford a cremation or a burial.
Right.
So we try to work with them. Then the death store. And of course, people say, Bodhi, I love what you're doing, but you can't call it the death store. And they've given me hundreds of better
options, right.
And maybe they're right. I could be shooting myself in the foot because we have death and dying are almost taboo words in our culture. That
it's a youth-oriented society. Every bit of media, is dedicated to selling consumer products to young people.
Well, that is the message that the culture is sending out about death and dying. Don't think about it. Keep shopping, keep plugging into your favorite devices, listening to your favorite music,
right.
et cetera, following your favorite rock stars and sports figures, and everything will be fine.
Right.
It doesn't actually play out that way, but that's the cultural message.
Right.
So the Death Store is a community educational resource center. We want to provide education and resources. We have a library, a reference library, a bookstore, home funeral supplies. There are end-of-life and bereavement counselors on staff, ordained interfaith ministers on staff. There's a bedside notary that'll come to your home. Funeral directors, counselors, trained hospice volunteers. We're starting to train our own volunteers who have completed hospice volunteer training. Another piece of this is the caregiving crisis that's happening not just here, but in America and maybe worldwide.
All those baby boomers.
People are dying differently than they were dying 40 years ago. When the intensive care unit was developed, it was developed as a consequence of people dying from stroke, heart attack, and accidents. Mm-hmm. The majority of people that are dying today are dying from cardiopulmonary disease, heart disease, cancer, complications from Alzheimer's, complications from diabetes, and people are dying now for years, can be dying for years.
Right.
Who's taking care of these people at home who can't afford full-time care?
Robots.
That's coming.
Robots are coming.
I know, robots are coming.
You got to figure, you see an old elder person walking with a walker, and you got to figure, you see a mall cop riding around on a Segway. Well, you got to figure that there are companies out there that are actively engaged in researching how do we turn that walker into a Segway so that they can get you out from your bed to your chair to the toilet and back again. And if they can provide that mobility to, an elderly person, then we're just going to be, continue in that cocooning process of individuals isolated in their own little cubicle and living their own little lives, connected by their technology, if they can still push buttons. And it will be robots because there are no people that are going to be willing to do that work.
Well, I don't agree with that. Although at first I was quite offended at the notion of we were going to be taken care of by robots. And the more I've looked into it, the more I've opened up to they could be very useful. But one of the things we're doing at Doorway into Light is when somebody contacts us because a family member is dying, we'll invite that family to create a potluck little party and invite all of their friends and neighbors to the potluck, and then we will come over and help train that community into a caregiving team to where the burden doesn't rest on any one person.
Sweet.
And is shared by the community.
Right.
It's a beautiful system, and now we're not talking about either strangers, even well-meaning strangers from hospice or any other service agency coming in, but actually people you know, your friends, your neighbors, the people you know you and care about you. Mm-hmm. And that pattern and system is working well in a lot of places. So that may be supplemented by robot caregivers, but the image of your own family and friends and neighbors, and again we come back to what builds a village and what builds community,
and it is,
and how do we grieve together.
Right.
I see more and more that grieving is kind of like when your little child falls and cracks their knee and goes running into her mom or dad's arms and is just crying and crying, and the parent can see that there's no real damage here and wraps his or her arms around her child, and soon enough, or sooner or later, that child is finished wailing and crying and gets up and runs off to play.
Right.
And that is, I'm seeing more and more, is how we grieve. Grieving is a community event that we as a village, as a community, can wrap our arms around people who are grieving. And I would say most of us are grieving. And again, it comes back to what you're speaking to in terms of what's happening in the world and where our power is in changing and transforming. And I'm convinced that our death phobia, our unwillingness to look at we will die and we don't know when, is directly related to our inability to engage fully in being alive. Mm-hmm. And showing up where we need to show up. Either we feel powerless or we think there's lots of time.
Well, it's supported, by the media. It's supported by all of the spending of corporations that want, to control the various different niches that they're in. And some of them just simply strike closer to home because they are bumping up against what used to be village life. And that our lives, it's not just a matter of what kind of car we're going to drive or whether it's good, or what have you. These are issues that are really, really fundamental. Where our food is coming from, how our food is grown, and how it affects the environment in which it's grown, and how we die, and what happens to our bodies after we die.
How we care for our dying, and how we care for our dead. And last night I spoke to, we don't have a relationship with the dead. They're gone. They don't need us. And so many cultures, so many indigenous peoples in the history of humans have ritual and ceremony to keep feeding the dead.
It takes a while for the spirit to travel from one plane to another.
And the ancestors are still here.
Right.
And how do we make that real? How does that become real to us when we lose grandma? And that's the word we use. We lost grandma. And so if we lost grandma, we surely have lost the ancestors. And here they are, wanting to support us and wanting our love and support as well.
Right.
That relationship continues. It's funny, I've met people who say when they die, they're going to go be with their mom or their husband. And it's a funny notion about time itself because, well, didn't your husband die 30 years ago? So is your husband in the past or is he in the future where you're going to die and go meet him? And it calls into this whole notion of where are the ancestors and where are the dead, and why so many cultures feed and nourish and relate to the dead. But certainly the environmental consequences of how we're treating the dead for the most part in this country is supremely toxic in terms of how much metal goes into the ground,
right.
how many hundreds of thousands of gallons of formaldehyde a known carcinogen.
Yeah, formaldehyde is really nasty stuff.
Embalmers have a higher rate of cancer than the rest of us.
Right.
What is it? 800,000 gallons go into the ground every year.
800,000 gallons of heavy metal chemicals go into the ground just to put a body in the ground that should be decomposing but won't be decomposing because of the preservatives they've pumped into the body. How screwed up is a system is that?
And we're burying bodies 6 feet in the ground where there are very few microorganisms to break down and decompose the body to turn it into food.
Right.
I mean, we are eating, no matter what your diet is, you could be a fruitarian. You are eating the results of things that have died in the ground.
Sure.
Right?
Sure. And we're all about microorganisms on this show.
I'm with you.
That's, you know, microorganisms are an essential ingredient to farming, and it's insane that you know, chemical agricultural practices as the norm in our nation are designed to kill diversity in the soil. They're killing the bacteria. How crazy is that? We need the bacteria for life. All forms of life are supported by symbiotic relationships with bacteria.
The fact that I even need to be out there educating people is just more proof of how disconnected we are to not only our bodies but our place in the natural order of things.
Yeah.
That we are nature. Nature's not out there. Life and death are dancing continuously. You can't have one without the other. And I see that conversation is even lost and left out of farming conversations. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not just dead things that are in the earth that provide life to plants. It's dead uncle and auntie. It's all the people who have died. It's all their bones. It's all their blood. And again, bringing this death phobia. Really, death phobia equals life phobia.
Yeah,
One, we think we have lots of time, and we have time to waste. We procrastinate. Imagine if you lived your life where you didn't know if you were going to see the person you were talking to again. How would that deepen, or would it deepen your relationship and your communication? You know, so many of us have had the experience of what happens when we find out somebody we know died or is dying. You know, we hear about people dying all the time, you know, in all kinds of ways, and in some way we're kind of jaded and have had to protect ourselves from the onslaught of injustice and violence in the world. So we're not really touched when we hear, or very, very much touched when we hear starvation here, plane crash there, bombings there.
School shooting.
School shooting has even become one of the norms.
It's like norm. How did that happen?
But what I do see is that for most of us, when we find out somebody close to us has died or is dying, something happens to us, and maybe even viscerally, that something happens to our body. And what that something
Hormones.
looks like is we cut out somehow we kind of drop, and the crap kind of moves off to the side
Momentarily.
and what's real and what's precious and what's fragile shows up. And of course, many spiritual paths describe that as a spiritual experience, when you come that present and you're here and you're grounded, and all the other crap that is crap gets pushed off the table.
Right.
And that happens to a lot of people when they find out somebody close to them has died. And many of us have been at memorials and funerals where everyone is in this raw space where there's just no room for nonsense and crap, which is really where most of us want to live, in that authentic, deep place where we allow ourselves to be touched by it all, and to be willing to touch it and to engage and not think we have lots of time.
Well, it's, you know, I'm not sure that most people, you know, want to live in that place. A lot of folks just seem really happy just being, you know, cogs on a wheel and just being consumers and just, you know, doing what they're told. I don't know. You know, we certainly, you know, here on Maui benefit from a community that I think is larger and more concentrated than most of people that are drawn to this environment here, because they do want to live a visceral life. They do want to live each day with wonder and with an energy in community. with one another. And, Maui has become a home for a lot of people who have that perspective. But it's a little bubble. And outside of that bubble, our consumers, our farmers that are farming, chemical agriculture because a corporation has lied to them and told them that that's, how things should be. The embalming is a great example of that. Embalming is a practice done today that's harmful to the earth and harmful to the morticians. It didn't exist before the Civil War.
Many people still think you're required to have a body embalmed, and yet no state in the country has any law requiring embalming unless you fly them out of state.
Mm-hmm. So it became a business practice in the Civil War. There were so many young dead soldiers, that they wanted to ship them home and to be able to get those bodies back to where they belonged. They started this practice of embalming. And the funeral homes, just sort of grew, and they were mom and pop, and they were, involved in the community in their own way. But now they're not really mom and pop; they're corporate controlled. All those funeral homes that have, individual names on them, even, companies here on Maui, those families sold those businesses a long time ago, or some of them just recently. There are corporate owners now that have no connection to the community and are selling and promoting processes that have no benefit really to the community. It's the same way with agriculture. We don't need major corporations dominating our agriculture because we need people using that agriculture actually growing food, and we don't have that. And this the whole understanding of death and dying and how we relate to it that's why we're having this show here. If you're wondering why if you follow this show and you're wondering why are we talking about death and dying, it's the same thing.
A lot of what I speak to is showing up in your life. And when people actually bring an awareness to them, an awareness that they're going to die and they don't know when. I mean, that's a big thing. Whether you use that piece of information or not really determines the course of your life.
Yeah.
And when you invite the fact that you're going to die and you don't know when, and your children and your family are going to die and you don't know when that becomes real, it changes your life. It really does make for less time to waste. It really does make relationships more intimate and meaningful. It does put you on a trail to find purpose and meaning. It does put you on the trail to find value, to add value to your community. It shakes you into, here I am and I don't know how long I'm here. How can I add value? I see why people are suffering when they're dying, and that's one of the big ones. I did not add value to the community. So the awareness of one's approaching death helps somebody show up in their life and helps them come out of this sleepwalking, hypnotic state our culture wants to keep us in, as you've described. It also helps you show up when you find out your neighbor or your friend or your family member is dying, because that's going to happen. And when I ask groups of people if they'd like their friends and family to show up around them when they're dying and help care for them, most people say yes. And when I ask groups of people if they think they're going to be called on at some point to show up for one of their friends or family, almost everyone says yes. So how do we show up in our life fully engaged? How do we show up fully engaged when the people around us need our help and are dying? And then what you're describing, we're looking, in my view, we're looking at a culture that is dying, and there's aspects of our culture that need to die that are what I say are eating the world. And it is, to me, it looks like it's in its real last stages, that it's really kind of peaking out, and more people are seeing it's not sustainable. In fact, it's not only not sustainable, it can't go on. And maybe it's going to crash, and maybe it needs to crash, and maybe things are going to get worse and more chaotic before we can emerge into the new paradigm and the new culture. Joanna Macy talks about the Great Turning, and and we're in the Great Turning, and she talks about the three responses that seem appropriate to respond to this great turning. And one are the people that are saying, stop the madness, and they get in the way of the madness, and they block the trains, and they get in front of Monsanto, and they're out there on the ocean stopping the whaling. The people that are just saying, stop, we have to stop, and we'll put our bodies in the way.
People like Bernie Sanders.
People like Bernie Sanders, yay Bernie. And the second response is the people who are developing the new sustainable, holistic ways that include the sacred, the schools, the alternative energy, the alternative healing modalities that respect the body not as a machine, but as an integrated whole. All of it, food, clothing, children, all of the new systems that are out there now
and
that
are growing. I mean,
are growing.
We're
and
seeing the rise of organic food, the rise of even naturopathic medicine. Hawaii has just stepped forward to embrace naturopathic doctors can be your primary care doctor. You don't have to go to a standard medical doctor now to be part of the system. The system is changing. We are making a difference, people.
And the third response, according to Joanna Macy, the first one being stop and getting in the way of the madness, the second being what's going to replace the madness, and the third being the transformation of consciousness itself. Because it won't matter if we're all driving around in electric cars if we're still screaming at each other and we're still caught in separation. That what happens to you has nothing to do with me.
Right.
And so here we're talking about showing up in how you live, showing up when you're asked to show up for people who are dying, and how will we show up when the culture that needs to collapse collapses, and maybe there's more chaos, and maybe we're going to need people that can stand in a solid place and be able to show up and help people in compassionate ways to ride through what could be a big storm. So for me, it's all about showing up, and it's all about not only the transformation of human consciousness, but what happens in that transformation and how we take care of each other and how we take care of the earth, and again, to connect with our relationship to why what we do to ourselves, we do to all of creation. And we can see now that through our toxic practices, it's all coming back.
Yeah.
The real terrorists are right here in the food and the air and the water.
There's more to our show in just a moment. This program is brought to you as a public service by Maui Causes. Maui Causes is a crowd-funded media production group that provides media production services to a variety of environmental and progressive causes here in Maui County. Visit us on the web at www.mauicauses.org.
I want to get away from the they scenario.
Okay.
And I'm an ordained interfaith minister in a Sufi lineage, and in our view, that the core wound is the disconnect from the holy. Consequently, the disconnect from our place in the natural order and and nature itself. If that is in fact the disconnect from the holy, then that's what I think needs to be spoken to, and in the recognition that there's really only one of us. Monsanto, I think, is doing horrible things out there, but Monsanto is made up of people just like you and me, more or less, who want to feed their families and want to pay the bills and want to have healthy kids, and are just caught in a different scenario that technology is the way.
They're caught.
And actually, most people are caught in the scenario that technology is what's going to save us.
They're caught in their jobs.
And yet, if you follow technology as it was touted from the 40s or 50s on, at the end of the war, when fertilizer became made out of the oil they were no longer using to make bombs with, or that kind of thing. Well, and we were sold at all these world's fairs that technology was going to make life beautiful and nobody would have to work, and we'd all be rich, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, the world, I'm in my 60s, the world is more unsafe, the world is more toxic, there's more violence, there's still wars. There have been wars going on since I've been born.
Yeah.
On and on and on. Technology is not proving to be the savior, and yet so many of us are still on the technology is going to save us. And I don't believe that that's true anymore. But certainly the people who are just like you and me, caught in not only in a job, but caught in a mode of seeing how it is that technology is going to save us. So I'm careful to not get into the they paradigm. Yes, Monsanto needs to be basically bought out and reconfigured. But Monsanto are people like us.
Oh, there are people like us, but we're dealing with a business structure and we're dealing with a corporate structure, and it's interesting because all of these issues come around full circle. We're living longer, as a people. The health care and the medicines and the technology is allowing us to live longer, and there are people that in business. Who practice predatory capitalism that are living longer and having a continued effect on the business and political structure beyond their years. Those people should have died earlier so that they gave control and power away to their children who are more in tune with the world today. We're dealing with a business and a corporate structure and a political structure that's based on ideas and concepts that are 100 years old.
Well, if you look at the people who run our government, they're mostly old white folk.
Yeah. This is what I'm talking about.
Old white male folk.
Medical care. Nothing. They God bless them. Let them pass and move on and open the door for change to come through. That's more appropriate with what the needs of the world are, rather than having this draconian control over every aspect of people's lives, so that corporations can make profits for Wall Street. And that people, that we are disconnected from one another and the villages that we need to really live a full and rewarding life. So doing work in this community, you have a resource center in the death store. How can people connect to you at the death store?
We're on West Quiaha in Haiku, in the old Pauwela Cannery. The store itself, the death store, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 9 to 1. Our funeral home is on call 24 hours a day, 575-7870. We have a website, doorwayintolight.org. We have a number of associates now participating in supporting the educational aspects. We're now making presentations to Rotary clubs, looking to make presentations to churches. Really the biggest obstacle to what we're offering is people knowing what we're offering. So here's a great opportunity, you having me on your show to help get out there that this is going on Maui, that we're out to help people. We want to help people who are dying. We want to help their families. We want to help people in caring for their dead and the dying. As I said, most of us are grieving. We're either grieving personal loss that we never really fully grieved, or we're supported by our culture or our families to grieve, or so many of us are grieving what's happened to the world itself. Mm-hmm. Many of us are grieving that so much of creation is on the run from us. How many of us are grieving what our government does in our name in so many places in the world? And that grieving hasn't really had a place in the commons to be spoken to. So much of it has kind of gone underneath, and I think it makes us sick. I think congestive heart failure it can also be attributed to a congested heart. Mm-hmm. The suicide piece, especially among young people, is an epidemic at this point. Yeah. And if you consider that so many of us, where is death in the mall? Where is death in the marketplace at the big box store? It's nowhere.
It's at the Pauwela Cannery.
It is at the Pauwela Cannery. Where is it at the dining room table with your family? Right. It's pretty much nowhere. Right. And in fact, some funeral homes are now opting for minivans instead of hearses, so you don't have to get upset because somebody in your neighborhood
You don't
died.
have to see it at all. all.
Nobody wants to rent a house to somebody who's dying, and nobody wants to tell you that the house they have for rent, somebody died in it. So something that's part of community life in almost every peoples in the world forever is pretty much invisible, except for what we see on TV or in the movies,
right.
or we hear about a horror story that one of our relatives was in the hospital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what has become fairly invisible, where does it go? It goes into the shadow. It's there, but it's not being, right? It's not being spoken to.
Right.
So of course, young people, teenagers, are inherently drawn to what's in the shadow. Mm-hmm. Right? So then when you combine that with so many young people feel lost and powerless, and what's the point, and they're trying to not buy into the message that they are their machines and accessories. They want to actually find out if they're in fact alive. And a brush with death is one of the surest ways to find out if you're alive. And in fact, almost every culture in the history of humans have had initiation for young people to basically leave their childhood,
have that experience.
To leave their childhood behind.
Right.
And almost every one of those initiatory experiences involves a close encounter with death.
Right.
We have none of that.
Well,
getting a driver's license,
the kids
having
are doing
sex.
The kids are doing it on their own with pharmaceutical taking. You know, we've lost friends in this community, young people in this community, because the teenagers were, you know, having a party and they were just dumping their pharmaceuticals into a bowl and picking a couple colors out, not knowing or caring what combinations of pharmaceuticals they were taking, knowing that they were at risk, but they wanted to create. The notion is that they wanted to create that life and death situation, that life and death energy, because their culture is not providing it for them. They're creating it themselves, because it is a part of our humanness. It is a part of a rite of passage that a maturing psychology as an individual, we require that.
Supposedly someone in Hawaii commits suicide every 2 days. And supposedly for every person that commits suicide, 25 people attempt to commit suicide. 22 veterans kill themselves every day, right? You know, I just read that there's a spike in white males between the ages of 30 and 40-something committing suicide. You know, suicide's an epidemic. Yeah. And again, it's pretty much pushed into the shadow.
Right. There's going to be more of it. It will become a growing thing as you know, people, unless we are able to take back our processes, unless we are able to stop the corporations from dominating our society.
Well, regardless of where the corporations dominate our society, loneliness itself is an epidemic.
Exactly.
Right? And here we are, and almost everybody now wants to vote for you to be able to decide when to end your life. Mm-hmm. Now, for me, in my view, suicide and choosing to end your life because you're in too much pain, or the quality of life has deteriorated to such a degree, to me, those things are not really separate. Ending a life there always has a psychological component to
mm-hmm.
it. And here we are, and pretty much everybody is voting for you ought to be able to take a pill when you want to die.
Well, we have the right to have a do not resuscitate. We have the right to have a DNR, and that is in some ways, you know, related to suicide. It is in some ways related to taking a pill.
This is a huge issue because, one, I would say most of us are control freaks, and sure enough, we want to control how and when we die and what we look like. And another piece of it is, again, I think I mentioned this, we don't value dying itself.
Right.
We don't see any value in dying. And as the last few generations of us have grown up taking a pill for everything. Not feeling good? Take a pill. Depressed? Take a pill. There's a pill for grieving now. Take a pill. You know, not sleeping? Take a pill. So, of course, when it comes to dying, if now we're being offered the opportunity to take a pill, well, yeah, take a pill. We've grown up on taking a pill, and there are vast cultural and social implications and probably political implications in us all being able to walk into the drugstore and buy the pill. Why is it now in the few states where it's legal that doctors decide when enough is enough?
Right.
Well, why don't we have the right to say when enough is enough? So if you follow that slippery slope to where you can go into a pharmacy and next to the condoms are the pills to end your life, what happens to a culture when our grandchildren grow up thinking that dying is something you take a pill for? May it never come to that, but surely that's the direction it's heading. And again, these are all interconnected. We could connect what's happening in the world in terms of corporation and government control with our own sense of needing to be in control, and who's in control anyway, and are we even in control? And again, for me, it comes back to the core disconnect from the sacred. Sacred as a value has pretty much disappeared from the culture.
Right.
It's rarely in the conversation. And what would it be if sacred was part of how we farm, of how we feed each other, of how we take care of each other? And that disconnect from the holy or the sacred or God or whatever name you give to it, without that, we're broken.
Yeah.
And every indigenous culture that watched us come marching through with the good news, I don't know of any culture that went, we got to give up what we're doing. They got it right. Almost every culture was like, let's stay out of these guys' way. They're on a death trip. And that's the way it's playing out. So how are we going to show up as we get to the ending of things, many of which are so toxic and destroying the planet, that need to end, and be able to show up so our grandchildren have something to plant trees on?
Yeah. And that's why this is, such an important issue, and why, understanding and having an intimacy with death and our own mortality is so important, because it does provide sort of a crack into which people are able to peer into the infinite. And they're able to peer, unfortunately it happens by surprise when you're not prepared for it, when a loved one passes and no one's prepared for it. They've all been, denying themselves, denying that this could happen. They're unprepared, and they're exposed to the greed, that's out there, that's willing to take their money and not really solve their problems. One of the great educational components that Doorway into Light and the Death Store provides in this community is educating people on what their personal alternatives are, as opposed to what the business would have you do. You can have a home funeral. Your organization is the only organization that is doing at-sea burials. You can be buried at sea. So, Bodhi, speak a little bit, we've got a few minutes left, on some of those things that people don't know. What are their rights, and what can be different in a family funeral as opposed to a business funeral?
Well, in Hawaii, that you legally have 30 hours before a body needs to, once a body is dead, before a body needs to be cremated, buried at sea, or refrigerated in a certified refrigerator. Mm-hmm. But in those 30 hours, we've helped people bring home a family member from the hospital to be at home for so many hours. There are other people in our community that have strong beliefs about the body resting at home, maybe not even being touched for 2 or 3 days. Mm-hmm. When people have strong religious beliefs, we'll help people keep their loved ones home for 2 or 3 days, helping keep the body cold, helping keep the body free from flies, helping keep the body smelling good. And people have had amazing ritual and ceremony, not ones that we bring to the home, but that we help families create specific to their loved one, and sometimes gone directly from there to the green burial at the cemetery, mm-hmm. or directly to the boat out to sea. And when people see, often now the reflex is when somebody dies, we immediately call the funeral home, please come and take this body away. Right. Maybe we're afraid we'll catch something. But certainly there's an aversion to being around a dead body. Now for many people that's changing, but that's still the common reflex. Often when that happens and people come, strangers, well-meaning people, but strangers come to pick up the body, the next time you normally see that body, it's either embalmed and maybe looks like grandma, or you come to pick up the ashes. Right. And that break from the time that person died to what you then next see to me, it looks like a big break in your ability to grieve. In not being part of that whole process,
right.
It breaks your ability to grieve. And in a culture that doesn't value or believe in grieving, there's a lot of people with a lot of unresolved grief. And to be part of it, in fact, we used to have a relationship with one of the funeral homes here before it got bought by a big corporation, where the family could accompany the body down to the crematory, and if they wanted to push their loved one into the crematory and press the button that started the fire, they could.
They're not able to do that anymore?
I don't know that. I know we're not allowed to come bring the family to that. And that's a very powerful.
Yeah, it's a very important
Not
moment.
every family chooses to do that, but
right.
it's and the same with. And now we're out to build a different kind of cemetery here on Maui, a conservation cemetery. The common model of a cemetery is gravestones, one single purpose, taken out of the public domain forever.
Right.
We're looking to create a conservation cemetery on Maui where families, if they want, could dig the hole. And maybe we only bury bodies 3 feet under the ground where there are still many microorganisms active. We plant a tree or native.
Wouldn't the Department of Health freak out?
The law actually says a body needs to be buried deep enough so animals won't dig it up. Right? That's the law.
Right.
So we want to plant trees and native plants and actually have walking trails and picnic areas and memorial groves and meditation zones and labyrinths and actually use it as park, open space. Uncle Bill could turn into the Uncle Bill avocado.
Right.
So in other words, now using a conservation cemetery, instead of gravestones everywhere, we now have native plants and trees and maybe fruit-bearing trees and open space and parks. So now we've turned something into multi-purpose, right. And now protected as conservation easement, where the cemetery itself becomes an economic engine to protect and preserve land here on Maui. And the Hawaii Island Land Trust is very much interested in partnering with us to create such a place on Maui, which would be the first in Hawaii. So now we have no longer a single use taken out of the public domain forever. Right. We're talking about land that is now kept in the public domain forever as multi-purpose park, open space, greenways, agriculture. That's a vision that's starting to sprout up across the U.S.
That's great, and it's in reaction to some of the extreme waste that is incorporated into the way that a typical funeral home will stage your burial in a steel casket and concrete liners and formaldehyde.
Tropical hardwoods, concrete, plastic.
All that stuff's going into the ground.
There's approximately 1 million acres in America now in that scenario. Formaldehyde, metal, concrete, 1 million acres.
Toxic memorial parks.
Maui's less than 500,000 acres, so we're talking about more than 2 Mauis filled with gravestones in America right now.
Right.
One single purpose taken out of the public domain forever.
Forever.
So that's one of the things, that's our bigger vision, and to actually create a school through our educational series to help people the whole spectrum of wholehearted and sacred living and dying. How does our relationship to our approaching death inform conscious, awakened, conscientious living? And we'd love to create a place where people could come to die. Maybe they even could look out to their future gravesite. Create a school of trained conscious caregivers to support people who are dying. So there's a big vision that wants to happen on Maui, and we're looking for land and money and people that want to support that vision, because Maui really can be the showcase on so many levels for so many things. Here we have this amazing opportunity now with all this sugarcane land. Yep. Tremendous opportunity. We could be a showcase for the world.
We deserve better, and that's why we bring these issues to you on this show, is because you do deserve better. There's no real good reason that your children, should be be looking at a lifetime of disease because they were exposed to chemicals that should not have been distributed in these lands. The islands are a small place. There's no place for it to go. It's gone, our reefs are being poisoned, and there's no real good reason for it. They're not growing food. It's not anything that we can eat that's being, produced in those fields. We're importing 90% of our food. 90% of the food, here on Maui comes in. It's shipped in. It wasn't, 2 generations ago that 90% of our food was grown here on these islands, and we had enough to ship off to the mainland. We're trying to reclaim, and this movement, the death awareness movement, is part of that revolution. It's part of educating the public and bringing change. And I thank you so much for all of your efforts to do that. You've been doing this now for a number of years.
2006 we started into this.
Yeah. How can people support you? Again, why don't you give us your contacts?
Coming to the store, 375 West Quiaha, the Poela Cannery in Haiku, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 9 to 1 p.m. Please come see what we're doing. Come connect with us. We want to meet you, and we want you to see what we're up to. We want you to know how we can be useful, and certainly in helping you educate yourselves and see how we can support you, your family members, people who are dying, people who are grieving. Actually, we say anybody who wants to explore their own approaching death, and anyone who may die one day, we have support. Again, the number 575-7870. You can email me, Bodhi, B-O-D-H-I, at doorwayintolight.org. And go visit our website, www.doorwayintolight.org. If you or someone you know has land or the financial ability to help us grow the vision we're working on and help create a conservation cemetery and a dying center on Maui, please get in touch with us. And but certainly getting it out here right here has been super helpful. Again, educate people that we're even here and what we're up to.
This program is brought to you as a public service by Maui Causes. Maui Causes is a crowd-funded media production group that provides media production services to a variety of environmental and progressive causes here in Maui County. Visit us on the web at www.mauicauses.org.